for coming, and thanks to professors for bringing this group together. I'm really honored to be here talking to you and exchanging ideas, mainly. So we're going to be talking or thinking about the future, but thinking about it in a very particular way. In other words, the future as nonfiction or the future as documentary. And so mostly what we're used to thinking of in terms of future narratives, future storytelling, is like science fiction, apocalyptic narratives, like Hunger Games, Snowpiercer, flights of fantasy, okay? So what we're looking at today is something a little different. It's the future as nonfiction or as documentary, okay? And so it's an attempt on the part of writers like the Alan Wiseman that you read for today, and also the part of filmmakers to present the future as fact, okay? It may sound paradoxical, okay? And so what they're trying to do is create memories of tomorrow. What does tomorrow look like in retrospect? And that's very different, it seems to me, from, to take the example, say, of the Hunger Games, where you have commentary on the present, but it's framed as a fantasy, okay? So these are writers and filmmakers who are wanting to get away from the idea of fantasy and to get closer to the realm of fact, even though they're talking about 30, 50, 100 years from now, okay? So it's a kind of a paradoxical way of thinking about the future, because the one thing that we know about the future is it's uncertain. So how do these writers and filmmakers tell stories as if they were factual, even though they're writing or filming something that is 50 years, 100 years away, okay? And so why I started getting interested in this was that I noticed that there were these books appearing like The World Without Us. There's another book called The World After Us. The History Channel had a series that was very popular called Life Without People, okay? So there's a kind of there's a gathering together of interest in what the world would look like without people, okay? And so I think there's for a lot of religions, for a lot of human history, the whole point of Earth was it's the place of people, like it's ours, either to look after or destroy or whatever. But the Earth without people has been of very little interest, okay? Now suddenly there's this interest in the idea of the Earth without people. And one of the things that I started noticing with these films and these works of documentary nonfiction was that a lot of them avoided apocalypse, okay? In other words, they don't tell you how the people disappeared. They just say, let's remove the people and see what happens, okay? And if there's an element of interest there, it's that when you remove the people, stuff still happens, okay? It's not that everything stops. We don't control everything. And so I think that is part of the appeal, if you like, of these stories, and part of their power is that they're trying to be different from apocalyptic stories of the end of humans, and they're also trying to be different from science fiction, okay? And I think in reading these nonfiction stories, narratives, and also in looking at the documentaries, one of the things to be aware of is when the future is presented as if it has already happened. In other words, how comfortable are we as viewers or as readers with certainty? Okay? And it seems to me that one of the things that is happening here is that rather than focusing on stories of possibility, these filmmakers and writers are trying to talk about stories of probability. What will probably happen, okay? And so that's very dependent on science. And so that the scientific context of knowing things about engineering, knowing things about ecosystems, environmental systems, has a lot to do with, I think, the sudden emergence of these types of documentaries focused on the future. So I won't say anything more at this point. I'm really interested in your response, but maybe we could just show these three documentaries, where it's actually one little interview, one plug for the History Channel series, and then something from Shell. Actually, before I do that, I should say that the third of the things that we're viewing is from the Shell Corporation, looking at the year 2050. And what you get is two different forms of speculative nonfiction, two different forms of anticipatory history, if that makes sense. And so this was the other dimension of this that interested me, is that so many of these corporations like Shell, Exxon, Mobil, BP, these big oil corporations, were in the business of creating the future as past. And certainly a lot of them are hiring people that they call in-house futurists, okay? So if you're in communication studies or in English and you want a job, knock on the door of Shell and say, hey, I'm your next in-house futurist, okay? So there's a business side to this as well, to being able to promote a certain version of the future as factual, as likely to happen. Okay, so I'll leave it there, and then we can see the videos and have a discussion from there. So the first one is just the writer talking about his ideas for the book.
My name is Alan Wiseman. I'm a journalist from the United States. I've covered the environment all over the world, and I finally brought together a lot of my research and added a lot more to write a book called The World Without Us. I extract human beings so we can see what it would be like if everything else that lives here wouldn't have to deal with the constant daily pressure that we heap on it. What if that were relaxed? How would everything else alive invade our spaces, take over, replenish or restore, or create something new? And also, what would it do with all the stuff that we would leave behind? Everything from our materials to our buildings, our infrastructure, some of our beautiful things like our artwork, and also some things like all the carbon dioxide that we've dug out of the ground and pumped up into the atmosphere. I begin this book in a place without humans, the last fragment of primeval wilderness in Europe. It's a forest on the Polish-Belarusian border that since the 14th century was preserved by first a series of Polish kings and then Russian czars and then eventually as a national park. When you go in there, you see what all of Europe was once like. It's just a small core, but there's even European bison that still exists there. And then I literally show how it is that we have separated ourselves from nature, walled ourselves off from it, I guess, by moving into a house and showing how, if we weren't around, how nature would demolish our houses and literally tear down those walls. And it happens very quickly without human maintenance. And from there I expand to how a city. I pick New York City in this book because it's sort of the epitome of an urban landscape. We just think of this island, Manhattan, that's sprouting concrete, and the thought of it reverting to forest the way it was when the Dutch first saw it in 1609, it seems almost impossible. And yet, when I went there and I talked to architects and urban engineers and botanists and the personnel who maintain the infrastructure of that city, from its bridges to its subways, I learned that not only could nature tear all that stuff down if humans weren't there taking care of it, but it certainly would, and one day, in fact, it will. And New York and every other city, for that matter, will be replaced. In New York, I show how it starts with the subway system, which is underneath the water table and requires electric pumps going constantly to keep those subways dry. If humans were not there maintaining the pumps, or if nobody was maintaining the power plants, so the pumps went silent, the tunnels would fill with water, and the posts that hold up the streets would eventually corrode and collapse, and the streets would turn into rivers, as they once were before the hills that separated the original streams that drained Manhattan Island were all flattened down to superimpose a bit of streets. And pretty much what happens in New York would happen to most of the cities in the world, because nearly every city in the world was built alongside a water source. And that water source has been contained in some way to allow development right up alongside its banks. Without people maintaining the levees or maintaining the pumps, water will seek its natural level, and it will begin to undo the firm foundations of buildings. And just imagine a skyscraper in New York, waterlogged at its foundations, which it was not built to be, and when that unstable skyscraper gets hit by hurricane-force winds and topples, just like a big tree toppling in the forest, it's going to take down a lot of the smaller ones all around it. And eventually, our cities, without us, would be lying in ruins, and within a few hundred years, we'd have mature forests. That would be the most prominent features, not big skyscrapers.
What happens after we're gone?
In a world without people, any number of catastrophes will play out on a short timeline.
After what will happen to our bodies, to our monuments?
Very, very little of human existence would actually be recognizable.
Our bodies will feed a lot of animals.
With no humans around, these animals would be infected and would spread the disease.
If people were to vanish off the face of the earth,
If all the power went off,
What happens when that stops?
it's very sad to contemplate.
I would not want to be here to find out.
And 100 years after people are gone, this great engineering marvel essentially would cease to exist.
dogs without people right now die without air conditioning.
Structures hit so much decay when you leave them alight, they melt. There was once a row of stores along here with wooden shutters.
It would be the beginning phases of a green blanket.
Boston would be buried.
San Francisco is destined for oblivion.
After 1,000 years or so, there'll be very little evidence of the activities of man.
You just wonder what God hath wrought.
Life After People, the series. Every Tuesday night at 10, beginning April 21st on History.
So this is the Shell Corporation future scenarios.
Energy. It's central to our way of life and the driving force for many of the 20th century's greatest advances. Travel, communication, labor saving in the home. Thanks to massive improvements in energy supply over the last 100 years, these and other breakthroughs are reality, not dreams. With energy use expected to double by 2050, what transformations lie ahead? Shell uses scenarios to explore the future. Our scenarios are not mechanical forecasts. They recognize that people hold beliefs and make choices that can lead down different paths. They reveal different possible futures that are plausible and challenging. Our latest energy scenarios look at the world in the next half-century. We believe we are entering an era of revolutionary transitions. How will the world deal with them? 3 hard truths are driving the transitions. There is a surge in energy use. Traditional energy sources are struggling to keep up with demand, and rising emissions of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases are affecting levels of climate stress. We look at the choices these truths force people to consider through 2 different scenarios: the world of scramble and the world of blueprints. Both describe plausible, possible futures. In the scramble world, events outpace actions. Security of energy supply and fears of losing economic ground shape decision-making. For the next 10 years, people from all walks of life join in the debate about energy and climate change. But no one seems truly wedded to action on a large scale. Governments generally choose solutions that are politically straightforward and local. They prefer to rely on indigenous energy sources, so coal makes a big comeback in some regions, despite its higher emissions. Drivers stay with liquid fuels. With oil becoming harder to find and produce, biofuel use grows rapidly. Energy efficiency improves only gradually. Trading in emissions credits remains patchy and ineffective. Without a meaningful price, business lacks direction for technology investments to improve emissions management. In the scramble world, no one is prepared to change the status quo. Dealing with today's problem takes priority. By the 2020s, life has become volatile and uncertain. Energy availability is often tight. Severe weather events are blamed on a lack of previous action on climate change. The public cries out, and governments in the different regions respond in different ways, but without consistency or cohesion. Eventually, a new, more positive phase emerges. Enforced steps to reduce energy demand gradually have an effect. Background, individual, local efforts to promote renewable energy sources start to pay off. Renewables become well enough established and on a large enough scale to be competitive. Greenhouse gas emissions eventually begin to fall in the scramble world. But the earlier periods of economic volatility and the legacy of high emissions continue to have an impact. Because events outpaced actions, major work will still be needed after 2050 to achieve real sustainability. The world of blueprints shows what can happen when actions outpace events. Groups of seemingly disconnected people in California, venture capitalists, farmers, politicians, collaborate around opportunities for profitable action on climate change. Publics put international pressure on governments for change. Smart investments in modern facilities improve air pollution, energy efficiency, and greenhouse gas emissions, all at the same time. This isn't a sudden outbreak of altruism. It's a recognition of shared interests, new opportunities for profitable business, and the benefits of taking action before it's forced by circumstances. In the world of blueprints, local actions spread and join up. Like the C40 Megacities Pact of mayors and others, experimenting and sharing good practices around carbon emissions, transport, and energy efficiency. During the next decade, the blueprints world is diverse. Different parts use different approaches to promote energy efficiency and technology development. Some choose taxes, others use mandates. Some look for voluntary action by businesses and consumers. The most successful approaches spread. However, the diversity makes life difficult for investment. Pressure is created on local, national, and international authorities to harmonize arrangements better. With harmonization comes widespread adoption of good efficiency practices. Trading schemes for carbon dioxide emissions rights begin to cover a critical mass of industry sectors in a critical mass of countries. The ball is rolling. Meanwhile, meaningful carbon dioxide pricing gives people and organizations more incentive to improve their energy efficiency and invest in technologies, paving the way to carbon capture and storage after 2020. Meanwhile, transport is becoming greener through growth in hybrids and later full electric vehicles. Biofuels play a role alongside traditional oil products. By the 2040s, the blueprints world sees renewable energy technologies compete on price against fossil fuels, which are well managed with carbon capture and storage. So carbon emissions are well advanced on a downward path by mid-century. It's been a bumpy journey for some, but collaboration, successful carbon policies, and faster technology deployment have all contributed to a more sustainable world than scramble. Our two scenarios are quite different, but they share some common ground. Both recognize that the status quo will not continue. Both envisage an era of revolutionary transitions in the energy scene. Both recognize that most of the world's people will keep pursuing the higher living standards made possible by energy consumption. Both play out over 50 years. They show the immense impact on our generation and the next of the choices people make today in response to global challenges. At Shell, both scenarios help us in making our choices and preparing to face uncertainty. Traditionally, Shell uses its scenarios without expressing a preference for one over another. However, in a break with tradition, in our view, from the two scenarios, the blueprints outcomes offer the best hope for a sustainable future, whether or not they arise exactly in the way we describe. We are convinced they are possible with the right combination of policy, technology, and commitment from governments, industry, and society globally. But achieving them will not be easy, and time is short. We want to be part of developing the technologies the world needs. We want the guidance of new regulatory frameworks that will bring developments to a mass scale to make a difference. The Shell scenarios help us to make choices for our business. What choices do you face around energy demand and supply, contributing to social and economic development, and safeguarding the future of the planet?
Okay. So those are three very different takes on memories of tomorrow, of representing the future as if it were unfolding in the present or as if it were in the recent past. And so maybe we could just get some of your responses to some of the differences among those three different future scenarios. None of them is sort of officially science fiction, but they're all trying to draw in our interest, and they're all trying to, in some ways, manipulate a sense of what is a desirable future. And as one of them mentioned, they're all trying to create a sense of the plausible. Okay? And that's where it's very different from, say, apocalyptic or science fiction. They're not trying to have a break with reality. They're trying to say, okay, reality flows into the future. There's some person looking back on the future as if it were the past. Okay? So yeah, just any responses to the different mood, if you like, of those three pieces, the Alan Wiseman, which is what you read today, and the History Channel piece, and then the Shell piece. How they come across? Yeah.
This is more of an observation about the Shell piece, was that in the beginning when they were introducing like the scenarios about how like, for example, like all the pollution, and you see the guy wearing a mask.
Yeah.
That mask is actually like for training. It's not for like purifying air. So that's something that like boxers or like you know, like endurance athletes will use, because it restricts oxygen intake. So I just thought it was interesting that they decided to use that and kind of like spin it to seem like people are using them to purify the air.
Oh, okay. Well, I didn't notice that. So thank you. Yeah, no, that's interesting. Like, what are the reality effects in so forth? Yeah. Yeah.
I'm sort of, I hate to say it, I'm sort of skeptical of any future energy thing that's funded by an oil and gas company. The environment. I mean, I just find it very odd. It's like, yes, we are concerned with the future. I'm kind of not buying it.
Yeah. Okay. So why are you not buying it, and why?
Well, because they're vested. I mean, oil and gas. I mean, our reliance on oil and gas is, in some sense, a lot. You know, some could say is destroying this planet. So. Yeah. And they're an oil and gas company.
Yeah. So in other words, to what extent are they telling a neutral narrative in some way, and to what extent is it about brand maintenance or something? Yeah.
The History Channel piece seems more catastrophic, while this one seems a bit more pragmatic. But I'm also skeptical of Shell because they're responsible for one of the largest oil spills in the Niger Delta, which still devastated Nigeria to this day. Yeah. So for them to try and create some type of narrative that speaks upon conservation and preservation of the earth, I'm just like, that's not sure about. So
yeah. So for those of you who don't know the Niger Delta story, probably most famously through the execution of Ken Saro-Wiwa and 8 other Ogoni people in the Niger Delta region. What happened was that Shell had 2 basically discriminatory practices, so that when they were working in Europe and North America, they would adhere to certain high environmental standards. When they were in places like Nigeria, they abandoned those standards in collaboration with the government. And so there were these notorious oil spills that sort of ruined the fishing waters and the mangrove forests, and constant gas flaring that created poisonous fumes. And so they've been prosecuted and successfully sued for their actions, but they still haven't cleaned that up. So maybe from a Nigerian point of view, or that Shell is like maybe BP seems like if you're living in Louisiana. It's sort of it's a problem. Yeah, John.
That was one of the things that struck me. The other piece from Allianz. Allianz is a financial services and insurance company. So one of the things that we spend a lot of time in our classes studying is to check the source. So I mean, the chapter that we read today was, these things are going to happen. This is the infiltration of water into Manhattan. This is how humans keep it at bay. And when humans disappear, this will happen. It's a very definitive nonfiction story. You could almost make the same case for the History Channel, although they're CGIing it up to make it something sexy for the eyeballs. But when I'm looking at something like Allianz's video about climate change and Shell's thing about climate change, they're shading the future to determine particular outcomes they would like to see. And it almost seems like the sustainability of their business models or the sustainability of capital is paramount to them. Like Shell's thing proposes 2 futures, one chaotic, the other one where we kind of come together kumbaya style, but neither of them demonstrate that Shell has any agency to be a part of this process. The government has to do stuff. local small-scale marketplace has to do stuff. Meanwhile, as someone else pointed out, their corporate history shows that they've actually been knowing about this for decades, have denied it for decades. So for them to come out in 2008 and say, by 2050 things could be very bad, unless all of you in the world do something other than us, because we're just helpful corporate stewards that want to make the future happen, strikes me as being very disingenuous and not necessarily non-fictional. You know what I mean?
Well, that's I think a really good point. Is like nonfiction can be a kind of camouflage for an agenda, and if this were presented as science fiction, then you'd say, well, okay, this is entertainment. To what extent is the documentary aura, the atmosphere, being used to pitch a certain agenda and exclude some of these questions that you mentioned about agency, responsibility? Where is Shell in this, other than producing the movie? Yeah.
I was going to agree with him. I think that putting the onus right on the viewers, on us, on society, was a little bit of a misstep, I think, in that. But I was going to go back to the History Channel one, especially. I was kind of struck with how, right, with these sort of catastrophic movie-like scenes, we're supposed to. It's almost like they're privileging us with the privilege of seeing this thing that we're so entertained by a lot of the time, and also so terrified by. But putting that in the future, I don't know. It was strange to me to think that, like, are we? As someone's mentioned in there, it's like I wouldn't want to be around to see it. But how many of us were? That was the thing that glued us most to the screen in any of those three videos.
Yeah. So yeah, other responses to the sensationalism, if you like, of the second one, as opposed to, say, the Wise Men. I think both in the book and in the little interview clip, his tone is very different from the History Channel, and the way they're trying to grab, the two are trying to grab you, is very different emotionally. Yeah.
Well, reading the chapter that you sent, I mean, it's a look into the future, but it seems a lot more. It seems more realistic when reading Wiseman's that chapter. He breaks down like the things that are going to happen and why they're going to happen.
Yeah.
And I was reading it and I was just like, Jesus, this is New York. Would I live to see this? And it's a scary thought, because he puts a lot of thought into how the future is going to pan out, how things are going to fall apart, as opposed to the History Channel piece. Again, it's so out of this world. It's so it's kind of like watching a movie, and it's not as believable because it's so sensational. It's so out of this world. And then the Shell piece, I just kind of like brushed off as whatever, because it's Shell. And but the reading in itself was very it was very real reading. Just sitting here, seeing how the trains could fill up with water, and why they would.
Yeah, so I think that's one of the interesting things about the reading, is that how detailed it is, how specific, how textured, the fact that he's interviewing people who do the job that prevent that from happening. I think that, that's very different from the big collapsing skyscrapers in the sky and the bridges falling in. In a sense, we know how to respond to those, but we don't get the stories of the nuts and bolts of the engineering of a city as often.
I believe in Iceland's piece, that was the first one where I didn't read the book, or maybe necessarily the class that day, but from that short piece, when he was explaining certain details, he made it a point to say he had spoken to people and coming up with these concepts of how things deteriorate and details of that, and that's a stark difference from what would follow the next two that would follow. And I think that what you see in that it wasn't very it didn't seem dramatized. It kind of just seemed more like a natural process as he explained it. The other two were much more sensationalistic, trying to harbor some type of fear out of the viewer, while the first, I didn't believe, was trying to harbor fear per se. It was just kind of stating that this is a possibility based on this world I'm putting together.
Yeah, I'm glad you raised the question of fear, because what is the effect of him describing in the chapter and in this little excerpt here, this integration without foregrounding fear or without trying to highlight fear? I mean, most of us prefer it if the subway system works, which it doesn't very often, but doesn't collapse, you know. So what is the effect reading that? You're reading about something disintegrating, but it's not all about the fear. And I'll come back to you in a minute. But yes?
I think that, yeah, like, maybe if it's not foregrounded with fear, there is sort of something that's still removing what I think his sort of view and the way he talks about it, that's pushing it a little towards maybe like a romanticism of the rewilding of the earth and like this sort of, you know, beautiful idyllic kind of world that we'll be left with afterwards, which I'm not so sure is exactly right. It's exactly right down the straight and narrow either.
Yeah. So you want to answer?
Well, I was just going to say that it's a form of picturesque. It's like Thomas Cole's Course of Empire. You know, you see the things falling, you think, oh, how beautiful the ivy is and all this kind of stuff. And those of us who were here during Hurricane Sandy know how very little it takes to make life totally unsupportable. I mean, the subway tunnels filled up with water in one afternoon or one evening, and we couldn't use them for ages. And it also, not quite the same thing, but it made me, all of this, it made me realize somehow how alive all these monuments are. In other words, that they don't stand there just in their own glory. They stand there because there's all these people sweeping and washing and hammering and nailing. I don't know if that's relevant.
Yeah, well, I think this question, to come back to maybe your point earlier, is the question of labor. Like the labor of maintaining invisible stability, invisible infrastructure. And I mean, I think it's a political point as well, because it's really hard to get the politicians to invest in infrastructure, because it's not sexy. It's just taken for granted. It's everyday life. But if those people weren't employed, if the engineers weren't working, if the people weren't constantly monitoring the bridges, these natural processes would overwhelm us, okay? So how do we, that's one question, is how do we get, make that a political issue? The fact that the most important jobs that many people have are the jobs that are invisible and the work that actually makes the city keep ticking over. Yeah.
Well, and this is in relation to what I was going to say before. I mean, that scenario, people wouldn't have to be obliterated entirely. It would just have to be a reduction in population. To that end, one motivation to get government to invest in infrastructure, which is what Obama wanted to do, and that is create jobs. That, you know, obviously there's a lot of work to be done, and I think a lot of this is being neglected, and if we created the jobs where people were working to maintain the buildings, maintain the bridges properly and the highways, then it would go back into the economy and out.
Yeah, so I think this does have a major connection to labor, in the sense that public works, as part of what government supports, as part of the reasons we pay our taxes, has been under attack. The idea of public employees, the idea that these are types of labor that don't make the headlines, okay? The ordinary worker makes. And that was something that I did feel reading that chapter. Sorry.
I think he hints at the fact that all of the work that we're doing doesn't kind of matter, because he hints at the fact that it's sort of inevitable, that we can't keep up with all this water that's like sort of flooding up underground. And in terms of the rewilding of the earth, he kind of brings it to like the present day. And he's like, well, we already got coyotes walking through Manhattan. Right. And he's like, it doesn't take much. Like the earth is already starting to reclaim itself with us here in the present day. So that's how I felt like he's really tying in this what if narrative into it's already happening.
Yeah, it's already always happening. And what you've seen, I mean, one of the things that we know about the earth is urbanization is taking place at a very, very rapid rate, so that we have these huge mega cities like Manila and Lagos and Delhi and, you know, and Shanghai, cities of 15, 20 million people, Mexico City. And more people are moving out of the countryside into the cities, okay? So more and more people are dependent on infrastructure, but they're not getting infrastructure services. And so that's where there's a lot of not only social volatility, but also volatility in relation to the natural forces that we're dependent on, like water in particular, and the implications for public health. And you know, if any of you have spent, I grew up in Africa, and you know, if you spend time in the tropics, you know, leave a piece of food on the table, and if you come back 3 days later, you've got a whole ecosystem. You know, it's like things change very, very fast. And the part of the world that we're living in here was forested, and what he's talking about is how quickly and in what form would the forest reclaim what we've created, and almost like as a mind game, what would be the things that last? They're not necessarily the things that we expect to last. Like what would survive? Yeah.
So I want to piggyback on what you just said, and then also kind of bring back what we talked about yesterday when we were talking about relationships with the environment and how we create these relationships with the environment. I do work in Barbuda, and just sort of we're analyzing this process in a place that has a different kind of relationship than we do in the U.S. or even in a city. They build these luxury hotels, and then they lay abandoned, and then the countryside takes over, and then they build another one a little bit down the beach, and then the countryside takes over, and so there's been like 4 or 5 of these.
And why have they been abandoned?
Because there's no one who comes.
Oh, okay.
Right? And so they don't have the infrastructure for the tourism. And so it's this really interesting narrative that happens in Barbuda about, well, so part of what their relationship with the environment is this, it's less fearful for this apocalyptic or that the nature will take over. I think kind of like what you were saying with leaving something on the table. Is that this, you have kind of a more accepting of like your place in the ecosystem. But they're also, we noticed that with that relationship, you don't fear climate change in the same kind of way. It's not this same kind of like we have to do all we can, like Shell's trying to say. It's more like, no, we have this relationship with the environment that, you know, when hurricanes come through or the plants come through, like we're just kind of, you know, we're not the stewards that maybe the Western world is.
Yeah, so that's an interesting point, because in so much environmental thinking, we think that we're in control of looking after this gentle, furry creature called the environment, okay? And what this does is dramatize the limits of our control and the fact that we're just one life form among many, okay? And so that can have a variety of emotional effects. It can be humbling, it can make us think, well, okay, we're not as big a deal as we think. It can be disturbing because you think, wow, you know, if I turn my back, that fig tree is going to eat me, you know, or whatever. But what it does is it stretches our imagination into the future and gets us thinking about both the kind of work that maintains, daily work that's necessary to maintaining a city, and also what happens if urbanization increases at the rate that it is without infrastructural support as well. Yeah.
I'm struck by that, and one of the senses that I got from the Wiseman was actually a sense of reassurance. And that's how I experienced it. I wasn't fearful.
Yeah.
And that actually then, on reflection, disturbed me a little bit.
Okay.
Because it suggested, don't worry, whatever we may be doing, the earth will find its balance.
Yes.
Right? We, as humans, we're not going to do anything that's going to upset, ultimately, the natural balance, right? You know, New York could be, you know, the nature would take over and everything would just be put back to normal, to some primordial kind of balance. So I wondered, you know, if anybody else experienced that sense of reassurance.
Yeah.
Because again, I then was skeptical of
Okay.
the politics of that.
Yeah. So did anybody else feel that way, this sort of skeptical of the mood of reassurance, which is both in the chapter and I think here too, he's very calm, like measured.
Yeah.
This will happen, that will happen.
And the cockroaches and rats will be taken care of. You know,
Yeah.
that's part of what I found reassuring. You know, like, don't worry, big trees will sprout, you know,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
rust will destroy the buildings.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there's an element of reassuring to it until you realize that our species is gone. You know, I mean, at that point, it doesn't really matter.
There's
because
that,
we're not
yes.
here, like, we're all dead. And there's also the notion, I think, that oftentimes when we're talking about this kind of speculative nonfiction it's an indeterminate point in the future. If there's one thing that Shell did that I liked in their piece was they put a timetable on it. You know, by 2050, these are some of our projections.
Right.
There's another article which, if you're interested in the book chapter that we read about New York, in the New Yorker magazine, written in December, called The Siege of Miami.
Yes.
And it's basically about how Miami, the water level is rising due to seawater rising, infiltrating the groundwater, and flooding multi-million-dollar suburbs right now. And it's the same kind of thing where these are the natural processes that are taking place. These are our political options and infrastructural options which we're considering dealing with them. But in the end, you know, we are going to have to basically reconsider the whole way by which we site our species in livable environments.
Yes.
So if you get a chance, read that.
Yeah,
It's
and
really
Miami is one of the top 10, or bottom 10, when you look at it, lowest lying 10 major cities in the world. I think 8 of them are in Asia, but I think what happens to Miami in terms of the American consciousness will be right at the front. And part of it is that it's built on limestone, so that it's not like, you know, a hard, solid, non-porous rock base, so that what is being, when you get a thunderstorm, water gets pumped into the bay and it comes back under through the limestone and up into houses. So as the article that John mentioned points out, there are these, you know, Russian and Latin American oligarchs or super wealthy people buying, you know, $50 million penthouses, and the projection is that within 15 to 20 years they'll have to take a canoe to get to their front door. So you know, there's a kind of a short-sightedness, and one of the things that this does is it creates, at least it extends our thinking. But to come back to Joseph's point, you know, I think Wiseman begins the book like this, and then he introduces more and more and more of the scary things. But the beginning of the book is kind of calm, and then he gets to, you know, atomic residues and depletion of the fishes and all the other human effects. So I think there's a kind of a seduction technique that this is something that we don't often think about, and particularly in a kind of neoliberal climate where public employment tends to get a bad rap. That the degree to which we're dependent on so many people doing these jobs, and the degree to which these kinds of jobs are often defunded under austerity and so forth, is something that I think a lot of people connect to. But I agree that his tone is very, very calming, and then it gets more and more alarming. And there's that kind of funny, almost funny moment in the clip where the guy says, the second one, where he said, it's really terrifying. I wouldn't want to be here to see it. Okay, and we've already seen Earth population 0, so we know he's not going to be there to see it. But that's the paradoxical feeling that you have in these kind of scenarios is, okay, so nobody's there, but somebody's filming this as if they were there. So it's a strange feeling. Or maybe there's just one person left who has an operating camera and a battery.
Yeah, I think maybe the sort of like the tone of writing is what can set speculative nonfiction apart from its, you know, predecessors of this more sort of this fervor of apocalyptic, you know, kind of imagining. And I did really kind of appreciate that. And I can see how, I haven't read the whole book, but I can see how he would sort of ramp it there. But to imagine a human voice in a post-human world, in order for us to be able to sort of get into that world, maybe we do need to be kind of,
Yeah, it's gentle,
into it, and also
gentle
like,
entry point.
and without that sort of like culture of fear that we're used to in describing these topics.
Yeah, I think, there is in some ways, I think a lot of people apocalypse exhaustion. Like, oh, we've seen this, and a lot of people have, lived through 9/11, lived through Sandy, lived through tsunamis in Asia, and all of those things. So there's a kind of a strange way in which apocalypse stops being apocalyptic. It's just, oh, that thing again, And is there another way to tell stories to engage our attention? I think that's what he's offering. And Mabina, and then.
I'm sorry, I had to step out for a bit. I might have missed this. But talking about speculative nonfiction, I'm thinking like all the policy documents, and those seem to be to me, there's a really interesting genre of like speculative nonfiction because they are speculation.
Yes.
But there are also, and they're projections, but they're also speculations that are realized.
Yes.
And so they're like kind of like the
Shell thing, yeah.
the shell idea there. And also then sort of like economics, right? And all of those, what we learned was when it comes down to it, that those were fictions passed off as nonfiction, but also that notion of speculation in that sense. So I'm just intrigued by sort of, there are these sort of very spectacular renderings.
Yes.
But then there is the mundane, day-to-day, incredible proliferation of speculative nonfiction that sort of permeates everything that we do.
Right.
So
I think that's very important that you raise that, because this question of policy that eliminates alternatives by trying to contain the possible stories as the probable story or as the only story. And so here, Shell generously gives us two options, okay? Chaos and blueprint. But it could have had Mars and Jupiter. It's why those two options? And as I think John pointed out earlier on, the onus is on us as choosers, like at a buffet. Oh, that's and so. And part of that is tactics of incorporation or appropriation. So you have the polar bear, you have the melting glacier, you have the protest, you have, this is all of humanity together. And we're all making wise choices, okay? And so rather than saying, oh, Shell would never show an image of a polar bear, they say, oh, this is our polar bear, this is part of the future, And so this is all the way going back to United Colors of Benetton and the multicultural sort of attempts on advertisers to incorporate people. The presentation of what are pretty much random alternatives, control versus out of control, choice A, choice B. What if you say no, neither of the above, but there's a different route, okay? But it's presented so calmly, as if technology and consumer choices will blend together and create the better future. Obviously, the other future is not the one that's desirable, but it's not. But it's presented in this kind of open way. Yeah.
I think another thing that probably skews the Shell presentation is the timing. Like I saw at the end, it said it was from 2008.
Yes.
So that was like before the whole fracking thing really started taking off. So like they mentioned, there's going to be a lack of natural resources, but like that was before the United States tapped into all of its reserves. Right. And all these other developed countries started tapping into its reserves. Yeah. So I wonder, like, how would the tone of the chaos portion sound differently if we were including things like fracking and other technologies that they've come across since then to increase the production in oil and stuff like that.
Yeah. So it's a good point that from 2008 to the present, already you've got missing bits of the definite future or the alternative futures. And most of those alternative futures, for instance, presented oil and gas prices is going up from scarcity and people empty pumps and so forth. Yeah.
That very part you're talking about, one of the things that caught my attention was they talked about how these are the two options, but they made it a point to say, and Shell will be, a piece of either thing that ends up happening, Shell will be here, and I thought that was kind of interesting. In our class, a big thing we do is we look at video news releases, and question the nature of that being incorporated. Now, while I'm not saying this is necessarily a video news release, that had an aspect to it to me because they made sure to kind of put that in there, that good guy Shell will be here to be a part of whatever happens, no matter what it is.
Right.
We're not telling you what we're going to do, but we'll be here.
You the people choose and we'll follow along. Okay?
Absolutely.
I definitely think that the Shell was a very, very clever piece of advertising, but at the same time, I did like it a lot more in the previous two because I think that nowadays there's a lot of media, just like literature and movies that are very dystopian and post-apocalyptic, and it's a very sort of romanticized view of it. Even something like The Hunger Games, which is very, very widely popular. If you actually think about it, it's a very crazy civilization, but it's still something, I wish I was there, And I feel like the first two kind of played a little bit too much into that kind of idealized sense of nature's gonna take over and everything will be beautiful. And even the parts where they were sort of well, dogs will die without air conditioning. I was really? You're talking about one thing, you're talking about all of the population of humankind being decimated, and then but no, there's been a dog trapped inside a house.
Right, this is an interesting word that you use, decimated. How do people, how does the life of humanity end in these first two?
Well, it's kind of ambiguous.
Yeah, okay. So what's going on here is a kind of a thought experiment where we say, what if we remove people and see what happens, but there's no body count, there's no description of how the people disappear. Okay, what's the mechanism there? And that affects the tone very much of these people because it's almost civilization's been overtaken by nature without pain or without suffering or without conflict. It just happens up there and then.
To society's sort of obsession with sublime, and how we sort of, this is what we think of. When we think of the end of the world, everyone thinks of how it's going to happen. It's pretty widely known that humanity is probably going to destroy itself. But it's sort of trying to appeal to society that way, and especially the History Channel, when they want to get viewers, that's how they bring them in. Whereas Shell is sort of I feel like it's a business tactic because they're saying, oh, well, we think that we need to take action to sort of repel the effects that will potentially happen or inevitably, depending on how you view it. But at the same time, it sort of makes the viewers say, oh, Shell is such a good company, now maybe we'll invest some of our money in this company because maybe they're implying that they want to find an extra, alternative source of fuel and things like that, but Shell's not going to do that.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, okay, so that's a good point. I don't know if you all did that, but the way in which, if I understand you rightly, Shell is on the side of people, okay? Shell is trying to present some options on behalf of human interests, whereas the other two are just observing processes. They're human neutral. They're neither for nor against humans. They're an eye of a fly on the wall because the fly outlasts the human. So there's an eye observing this, but it's not saying, oh my God, we've got to stop. Whereas Shell is saying, for humanity to flourish, these are the two paths, like Robert Frost through the wood, and this one is one less taken, this one is the other one. and how we are actively involved in the choosing. So that's a part of the seduction technique of that model, is to say the choice is in your hands. And as we know, and Exxon has these scenarios, and as we know from recent archival discoveries, that all the way going back to the 1970s, Exxon was very much aware of the impact of carbon emissions on climate. And they were talking very actively about how can we suppress this information, prevent it from going into the public domain, going back to the 70s. Okay? But they also had their scenario writers, and they also had their in-house futurists. So maybe some of you can become in-house futurists and like subvert it from within or something. Yes?
Speaking of many choices,
yes.
I hope this isn't disruptive, but so we're facing a lot of choices
yes.
in terms of these political or electoral choices, as much as we may or may not think that they will be effective. But I happen to have voter registration forms. Your votes are really important. This just allows you to choose a party that you want to participate in the primary with. It doesn't determine your future vote. But I would pass. Is it okay if I just pass these out?
Yeah. So we invited this Professor Nancy Romer, retired from Brooklyn College. She was a professor in psychology, and she's been very active in encouraging us, as a professor, and even now, encouraging us to participate as citizens. So we asked her if you had a few minutes, if that's okay.
That's fine.
And then if you fill them out now, we can collect them. It takes 2 minutes. You just need to know 1 minute of information. So I'm going to pass this around as is Nancy. And in the meantime, we have about 5-6 minutes for some more questions. So keep asking questions. It will pass around. If you fill them out now, that would be great. Thank you.
Okay. So, yeah, scramble versus blueprint. Yeah.
So there was two things that kind of stood out.
Sorry, could we keep quiet?
So there's two things that kind of stood out. One was there was a quote in here. Some people want to put the forest back the way it was 200 years ago. To do that, I tell them you got to put the Bronx back the way it was 200 years ago. And I think that stood out because it's he's talking about the future,
right?
But it's all intertwined. We've gotten to the point we are today, and we're going to get to the point we're going to be in 100 years from now because of what we did 200 years ago, or what we started doing 200 years ago. The second thing that stood out, because I took this a little different. I didn't take this as much as necessarily like the History Channel piece, but I did take it as, okay, this is not like the fine. Mother Nature is going to take over. The Earth is going to take over, and I didn't take it as it's going to be great, and we're going to live in nature. I took it as, okay, we've made these choices to create a world that we are comfortable with, right? And the second thing that stood out to me was below 131st Street and Lenox Avenue, for example, a rising underground river is corroding the bottom of the A, B, C, and D subway lines. Constantly men in reflective vests and denim roughouts, like Schubers and Briefas, are clambering around beneath the city to deal with the fact that under New York, groundwater is always rising. Yeah. So I mean, I kind of understand where everybody's coming from, where it's kind of romanticized, and it's like, it's not showing, not necessarily like the Shell piece or the History Channel piece, but I think it's very much in that chapter that we've made a lot of we've created a lot of bad things on this earth, in this city in particular, and we're gonna pay for it. And there was little bits and pieces talking about, again, labor and how people are the ones who are keeping us afloat, I guess.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Maybe literally, because it's talking about water.
Yeah, sure.
But he continues to beat on this fact in that section about how the water is rising and how water is corroding certain places in New York City. I think he also mentioned how some of the L lines in Uptown Manhattan would eventually, those things would come down and fall. And I think it's very much in your face in that piece that there's damage that's going to happen, there's damage going to be done. So I didn't take I didn't take it very like this post-apocalyptic. Oh
Yeah.
my God, we're in extreme trouble.
Yeah.
Dogs are gonna die.
Yeah. Yeah.
I took it as, okay, this is real.
Yeah.
This is happening,
Right.
and this is dangerous.
Yeah. And so maybe one of the things, the takeaways from that is how do our actions in the present, in a localized situation, like as an inhabitant in New York City, what do we not see, and what should we be seeing, and and how can that be integrated into the political process? In other words, the priorities of the city in relation to a sense of these natural forces always having to be maneuvered and channeled and controlled in some ways on a day-to-day basis. And I think because, I mean, this was written just before Hurricane Sandy, but it was written after 9/11. And so the sense in which the unimaginable became imaginable, and the degree to which that can change people's priorities. And so I think what he's looking at is the underground priorities here, the unseen priorities. And then later on he gets into, in the book, he gets into the more, the more dangerous residues, the things that seem maybe more intractable, harder to solve. But I think he does begin for a reason with engineering, because engineering is one of the areas where we do have more control and more choices. Once we get to species extinction and things like that, military residues, it's harder to know what our long-term legacy is. But it's a way of, if we talk about forecasting, it's a way of like hindcasting, like looking, predicting from, creating, as I say, these memories of tomorrow. But they are very politicized, and as Lubina was saying, all policy documents are involved in this. University planning documents are involved in this. And often what one needs to look at is, what are the choices that are being eliminated, and who is being made responsible for what happens? Where's responsibility? Come back to John's point originally, where's responsibility reside, and how can we channel our own, what may seem very limited powers, to helping realize these priorities as opposed to others. And I think in this chapter particularly, it's very much around public works and not taking that for granted. Okay. Yeah.
So, an important part of any kind of narrative is obviously imagination.
Yes.
Right? And institutionally speaking, like these kinds of powerful speculative non-fictions come from sides of the institutional power.
Yes.
Whereas a lot of the alternative imagination, if you're talking about different paths, different choices, seem to come more from fiction or from, so I'm wondering, like, how does fiction enter into sort of this
That's a really interesting point. So,
can I just add to that too? I was curious about some other sort of key elements of narrative.
Yeah.
Character, plot.
Right.
Right.
Scene. Yeah.
Scene, setting. We talked about mood for a while.
Yeah.
But the shell piece really doesn't. Part of the problem is it doesn't have any actors or agents, right, that we can identify as characters. Wiseman has a lot of characters, right?
Yeah.
And it enables him to do certain things.
Yes.
But I just wonder about what where all of these elements of sort of fiction and then creative writing and narrative come in.
Yeah. So with fiction, I mean, part of the impulse behind fiction is escape, but another one is to see ways of living, ways of being that are a response to frustration with existing ways of being. Okay, and so, but nonfiction can do many things as well. Documentary can do many things as well. It can be a form of witnessing from below. In other words, documenting. I mean, if we think of, say, Black Lives Matter and the role of video in that, of footage that wouldn't have been available and certainly wouldn't have been circulated 10, 15 years ago. Okay, so those forms of documentation are really critical, but it does have its limitations because of the degree to which in fictional form you can openly break with existing reality and have a flight of imagination that can be a stimulus to other forms of thought, but may have as obvious a pragmatic connection to existing social forms. So I think they have complementary roles. Just as, you know, when we're in the mood to see something, sometimes you want a feature film, sometimes you want a documentary. Yeah.
I was just going to add to that. You know, if you want to look for indicators of climate change outside of the news, but also still within like media, take example of reality television, or what they now call narrative nonfiction, where you have these two genres like Gold Rush and Prospectors, which is all about an ice road truckers. Anybody ever seen that? Yeah. Which is all about basically manipulating the environment for financial gain. But at the same time, as the next seasons come about, like the ice roads are melting quicker and the truckers got to drive faster to make the money that they made. Yeah. And on the flip side, you have shows like Life Below Zero and Alaskan Bush People, which basically say, if you want to opt out of modern human destructive environmental culture, just move up to the Arctic Circle and catch your fish. But at the same time, in those shows, oh, the ice has melted sooner, the rivers are flooding. And so you can actually see in present time through these nonfiction narratives the notion of climate change actually taking place, even if you're attempting to escape it for some sort of idyllic, extractive.
Right, and then the political question is, to what extent is climate change mentioned or incorporated in those narratives? And it isn't. And we saw that even with way back when with the March of the Penguins, that originally the French filmmaker had some climate change stuff in there because the ice was melting and the penguins had to swim further, and their food source was more remote, and some of them were dying off. And then when it came to be pitched to American distributors, they said, well, the climate change side of this is problematic, just let's stay with the penguins, okay? And so the question is, to what extent, even when you're dealing with icy environments, are there these kind of political no-go zones that are just on the outskirts of the story, and that we have to feed in ourselves in a way?
Well, maybe we should end there. Thank you
Yeah,
so much.
okay,
for
thanks.
coming.
Just three quick things. First of all, Professor Nixon's book, Slow Violence, is excellent. If you get a chance, read it. Secondly, later on in this very room at 3:40 p.m. today, we have a Visualizing New York History, a presentation by Eric Sanderson and Visionmaker at NYC, where they actually visualize New York as it could be. And it's a map. It's a really interesting interactive digital map making project, so take a look at that and other events. And if you have the registration cards, please give them to me. I'll be up front. If you can take a minute to fill them out, that's great. You don't have to vote. That'd be good if you do, but you should be able to vote.